I don't know. People in chat are asking like what I think could be done to fix the Israel-Palestine. Dude, I don't know. There is no solution that's going to make people happy. There is no way to get. Well, you know what the Palestinian people deserve? All of it back. Do you know what Israeli citizens deserve? To not be kicked out of the land they were born in. These two desires are completely irreconcilable. There is literally no way to make everyone happy. Whatever is going to happen is going to leave a lot of people upset, and honestly, a lot of people hurt. Like that's inevitable. And you know why that's happening? Thank Israel and thank Britain. Like, you know, that they are the original progenitors of this suffering. They are the people who have spawned it. It was guaranteed suffering that was set in the earth like a seed and has grown to a mighty tree of suffering. And the only, like, the tree can grow, the tree can be rooted, the tree can be burnt down. People are going to suffer no matter what happens. Personally, I think that ending the occupation, even though that could go wrong in many ways, will produce vastly less suffering than letting the status quo persist. Isn't it also America's fault too? I mean, it's a lot of people's fault, yeah. Unfortunately, the only way for Palestine to like achieve freedom is probably through a lot of suffering, like no matter what. Because the problem is that like as far as I can tell, and as far as like what seems to be the case is that like Israel just wants them dead and gone, and that everything that's happening is just sort of like incremental steps down a long road where the only end point of the path is the eradication of the Palestinian people. So I'm operating on the assumption that diplomacy is a non-starter. Like Israel has indicated plenty of times in the recent past that they cannot be like negotiated out of the current path they've taken. So outside of that, it seems like I have no idea. Like extremely mass coordinated, you know, protests, sort of mass waves of people moving to the fence, getting gunned down. But they've tried that before, didn't they? Try that? I don't know. The problem is that like unfortunately, like this is one of the situations where we're being doomed. I mean, maybe you could imagine they do it better, like they do an even better job. Like, what if they did this thing they've tried before, but they do it even better? But like, it really does seem like, look, I'll say this much, okay? Given the like circumstances and how bad things have been, Hamas may have done bad, but I definitely can understand why like some fucking disaffected, poor, barely even able to access clean drinking water kid in Palestine would think they have nothing they can do other than join Hamas, right? Like that's the end goal of the Israeli government's policies. You destroy all hope. So of course the only like actions left people feel they can take are to just throw their arms up and join a fucking Islamic jihadist group. Like we did the same shit with ISIS. We've done this before. We've done this shit before. The same pattern has played out multiple times. We know what happens. And by the way, I just want to be clear, okay? If any outside entity did to a group of Americans what Israel has done to Palestine, those encaptured Americans would be the most terrorists the world has ever seen, okay? If there was like an area the size of, I don't know, like North Carolina that got conquered and slowly pushed into an area about the size of like the city of Seattle with 2 million people there, and it was clear diplomacy wasn't going to work, and all the leaders of the political group that's like corralled them into that tiny space are arguing like basically eliminationist policies, that like the tide of violence spreading from that concentrated group of Americans would be biblical. It would not be, it would be unimaginable, you know? And we would all sympathize with them. They would be the good guys in that story. Like, obviously. If you take the raw facts of the story with Palestine and Israel, the Gaza Strip, and like all of the specifics of what's happened, and you leave out the proper nouns, the names, and you just like transcribe it into like, I don't know, a fantasy story or like a sci-fi story, whatever, it's obvious who the good guys are, and when there's some giant bloody revolution led by the oppressed people, that's clearly the good thing happening. Like, this is a premise so obvious and straightforward that even children's books like repeat it. Avatar: The Last Airbender, the fucking Hunger Games stories, these are like so morally uncomplicated that even in media intended for children, it's still understood that violence is an acceptable means of achieving freedom. Like, even like that's how simple it is morally, and that's what's happening here, you know. It really is that simple. The problem is that even if in the abstract violence would be a justified way of achieving freedom, that doesn't mean that all violence is capable of achieving freedom, and there are bad ways to do violence. Again, to really hem in on how like simple the morality of this is, in Avatar: The Last Airbender, again, this is not meant to be like Well, this is soy, I suppose. I just wanted to be clear how like straightforward this is, because everyone acts like the Israel-Palestine conflict is really complicated, but morally, it's like the simplest thing in the fucking universe. You know what I mean? It's like Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine and Russia is historically and logistically complicated. Morally, it is incredibly uncomplicated. You know, the morality of the Ukraine-Russia conflict could be explained to and understood by a 6-year-old, and they would understand it sufficiently. Like it is that straightforward. And likewise, like, I don't know, in The Last Airbender, you understand broadly the narrative that revolutionary violence against the Fire Nation is justified. But then early on, you have an example of an Earth Kingdom freedom fighter called Jet, who commits indiscriminate violence against civilians and is justly condemned by the narrative of the story. Early on, sort of indicating that there are lines that separate and acknowledge the difference between just and unjust violence, you know? Yeah, Jet was a Hamas militant. He was a jihadist, many such cases. So, like, the reason I'm saying this, again, it's not like, oh, it's like with Thanos or whatever. It's just, like, it really is quite simple. If the Palestinians were able to engage in a mass wave of violent revolutionary action, which freed their people and broke the back of the Israeli government, that would lead to a lot of innocent people dying, but it would be, if done correctly, or at least somewhat correctly, almost certainly morally justifiable. Because if you don't believe that that would be morally justifiable, you don't believe in the concept of like self-defense, right? Like if that's the case, then you have to oppose all war, all conflict, all the time. But Israel is constantly getting into wars on the pretext of self-defense. Like they've done it like half a dozen times over the course of their existence. So if you don't believe that violence in perceived self-defense is a justifiable way of freeing people, then you can't support the Palestinians or the Israeli state, which is an incoherent position, right? In reality, people will just say it's okay for the groups they like to do violence and not okay for the groups they don't like to do violence. Violence, obviously, is undesirable and should be avoided when possible, but the only institution with the power to change things without the use of violence would be Israel. And again, Israel has indicated they don't believe in diplomacy as a way of resolving this, because their resolution isn't something they need diplomacy for, just soldiers. So, yeah, playing devil's advocate for a second, they are literally surrounded by hostile Muslim-majority countries. You know which group of people is surrounded by a hostile, different ethnic and religious group as well? That's the thing, okay? If you believe that Israel has the right to defend itself and engage in defensive wars against their aggressive neighbors, then you necessarily have to afford that same privilege to the Palestinians. The difference, of course, being that while Israel is not under immediate threat by their outside neighbors and is militarily capable of defending itself and has control of its own resources and border, the Gaza Strip has none of those things. They have no control over their resources, no control over their border. They don't have the ability to defend themselves against Israel, and they are slowly but constantly losing land. So Israel has been much more successfully aggressive against Palestinians than any group has been to Israel. Israel has fought wars with its neighbors and won. Israel has the power and prestige and money to negotiate, to defend itself to the people outside their borders who hate them. Again, the Palestinians do not have this privilege when it comes to dealing with Israel. So it's just not... It's not fair, is the lesson here. It's not fair. It's an appropriate conflict to feel doomer over. Though don't feel doomer if you're Palestinian, because if you feel doomer when you're Palestinian, you'll probably join Hamas, and that won't fix anything.